Welcome anyone else as they get here, but I want to give Jason enough time. One thing to let you know on the front end is Jason has to leave before Sunday school normally ends. He's got a job to do. Unlike the priest, he has work to do at the next service. So he has to go get the choir ready and all the stuff he's got to do. So at that point, Reverend Katie will take over when he sneaks out. But I want to tell you why I'm excited about us doing this. A couple reasons. One, music has always been very important to our congregation. And not just having music, but having good music, but also music that's historically grounded. I'm also excited you can do this because Jason's love of worship and music is contagious. You talk to him and he gets excited. Every time we talk about liturgy, he gets excited. And y'all don't get to always see that side of it because it's usually in the planning, talking about it side. You see all the great output that the church does and the music we produce. So the opportunity in this class is for him to kind of talk about what's behind our hymnody. But what I'm excited about is you all getting to hear him and his love and excitement for the worship of the church. So I'm going to pass it over to the man of the hour.
All right. Good morning. So I guess this being Bible class, we should start with the Bible. Which is an interesting place to start when it comes to music, actually. Because it's one of the places where we have plenty of references to music, well, at least a good number of them, but we have absolutely no information about any of the practicalities of music making, which is a really interesting place to be in as a musician. So and that's where we're going to start. So when you think about music in the Bible, what comes to mind? The Psalms, right? The Psalms first. That's the big one, right? That's the longest book of the Bible, and it's also the songbook, right, of the Bible, and that's a great place to start. The only problem is, right? We don't know what they sounded like. We know that they were sung. The Psalms were sung, and but we don't know how often. We don't know exactly when. And we have, again, really no idea of how that whole tradition worked in both in temple worship and in the music of the early Christian church. So that's an interesting. We just have to take that as a given when we start, and then we can start a discussion. What about any other places in the Bible that you might think of for music?
There are references to, the lute, harp.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot of references to the lute and harp, lyre, pipe, timbrel, and dance. Right. All of those. As my friend priest Barrick Smith used to say, well, let's go back to the beginning. Which meant for him, he always went back to Genesis every time. And actually, with music, we can actually go back to Genesis. You've heard of Jubal, right? Oh, Had I Jubal's Lyre is a song by Handel. Well, Jubal was the son of Ada, who was the son of Lamech, who was the son of Methusael, who was the son of Mehujael, who was the son of Irad, who was the son of Enoch, who was the son of Enoch, the senior, who was the son of Cain, who was the son of Adam. So, and Jubal, his brother's name was Jubal. He was the ancestor of all those who play the lyre and pipe. So we have a reference to musicians as far as Genesis 4. Right, so very early in Genesis. And then, of course, we have the Psalms. But we also have in the Bible, we have something called canticles. And canticles are songs that are mentioned in the Bible. And so one of the big ones is the song of Moses after the Israel's deliverance at the Red Sea, right? In the translation, we sing for the great vigil of Easter, we sing ye to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Pharaoh's chariot and his host has he cast into the sea, right? And so we know that was actually sung because it says that it was sung. And then that continues on into the New Testament as well, right? Remember what happened after the Last Supper? And when they had sung an hymn, right? They went out to the Mount of Olives. And then, of course, St. Paul in places like Ephesians and Colossians, that's where we have, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your hearts sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God, right? So psalms we know, hymns and spiritual songs, the Greek there is not exactly clear. They're different, but nobody knows exactly how. Again, we arrive at this same predicament. So what happens then if we start seeing actually the implementation of music as part of worship? One of the earliest things we can go back to is the singing of the Hallel at the Passover Seder, right? The Hallel were Psalms 113 to 118, with 113 and 14 being sung before the meal, and then 116 through 18 after. And then this finds its way over into this was also a part of, I believe, temple worship, and then found its way into synagogue worship as kind of a substitute for the sacrifice being made in the temple. So the psalms being sung around what would have been the sacrifice, but not at the temple. So we have some references to this. The problem and the reason we don't have a lot of information about the early music of the church is simply because it was an oral tradition, right? So people didn't write things down the way we do today. By the 4th century, we start seeing hymns being written down. Now, when I say hymns, I'm talking about the texts, right? In the Eastern Church, they were slightly ahead of the Western Church, so you see a little bit more proliferation of hymns and notation by the 7th century. In the Western Church, it's by the 8th. But really, from the 9th to 11th century is when we actually start finally getting hymns and music that are written down with some sort of notation. And originally, this was really notes in the book. They would write out the words of whatever was being done, the psalm, and there are squiggles above them. And if you look at the old manuscripts, that's all it is. And the squiggles were just a reminder to the people who already knew how the stuff was supposed to be sung. It was just a reminder, oh, I need to go up here or down here. But they would have already known everything, again, still growing out of an oral tradition. But by the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, we chant, right? We're talking at this point about Gregorian chant, which has very little to do with Pope Gregory I. There was really no dove that sat on his shoulder and sang the chants into his ear, which he then wrote down, right? That's the legend. That didn't really quite work that way. Gregorian chants is actually a synthesis of two different styles of worship. One, the Roman Rite and the Gallican Rite, and together we call those Gregorian chant, but it's Roman chant. And so by about the 11th century, we really see a proliferation of the body of music in the church. And that's not just hymns, it's also primarily the Psalms. Actually, the Psalms is always where the music begins. And that's one of the first things that's sung in the church, or singing the Psalms. So that's actually where we're going to go. We're going to go to an example of some relatively early music here. So I need a volunteer who can help hold something on this podium. Any volunteers?
How you doing?
Okay, all right. Oh, here we go. Follow Michael.
No figured bass?
No figured bass. We're before figured bass. Right? Okay, so what we have here, this is an example of a chant that comes from a chant book. Any chant book that you see a date from sometime prior to the early 19th century. Really, they could date from a lot earlier than that. I don't know exactly when this one dates from. It was a gift to me. But what you notice is, well, what do you notice about the book? I'll let you tell me.
Big enough for the whole group to see at once.
Exactly, and that's exactly the way it was used. She said it's big enough for a whole group to see at once. And that's exactly what would happen. You would put the book down and you would crowd your singers around the book, and then they would sing off of the same book. right? And this was not really a problem because remember that when you went to church in the 11th century, 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, 15th century, 16th century, very few of the people in church were literate. And especially few of them were literate in Latin. Right, right. So you didn't have a lot of people who could actually read. And so, of course, there probably would have been a group, especially if you were, say, in a monastery or a convent. There would probably have been a group of people who had gained all of the body of music by hearing it and memorized it, right? Which is there. This is actually a bit of Psalm 19, and I have a. Let me make sure I don't make too many mistakes here, and I'll tell you actual verse numbers. So this is the end of the psalm, where we have an asterisk in our Psalter. They have a colon here. So this is Psalm 19. This is verse 9. Ipsi obligati sunt. They are bound and have fallen, but we are risen and set upright. And then you see how this right here is very nicely ornamented and in darker print. Yeah, and this is an abbreviation. DME with a squiggle above it is an abbreviation for Domine, God. Salvum fac regem. Domine salvum fac regem. You heard it a few months ago. God save the king, right? God save the king. Is right there. That's verse 10. And hear us in the day that we call upon thee. But what's interesting about this is a psalm. Obviously, 2 verses of the psalm, and this is the antiphon of the psalm, just like we do when we do plain song psalter in Lent, and the choir sings an antiphon at the beginning of the psalm or at the end of the psalm. That is notated here, right? And this is 4-line notation. Normally, our staves today have 5 lines, right? But you see, this is a C. And that is a C, right? The note C is right there. And so this is actually completely singable today. Right? Let me try it, right? Do, mi, so, mi, do, exaudiat te Dominus in de tribulationi. Sorry. Lationis Domine. And then we come to the Gloria Patri, but they didn't want to write out the Gloria Patri, glory be to the Father, all the time. So what they do is they just write out the vowels, E-U-O-U-A-E, which is the last part of et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Right? And so you would go back to your psalm tone, which was for this one, nun dom psalm. So that would be Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio, et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. And that's your chant for Sunday morning if you're using parts of that. So this is from a gradual, right? So that would contain the music for the psalms of worship. So that's where we get to. Thank you, Dave. So that's where we get to in about the 11th century. Right? And so 11th century goes on, 12th century goes on, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century goes on. What does worship look like in the early part of the 16th century in the church? What are you as a congregation doing in church in the first part of the 16th century? You're standing, right? There were no chairs. That's exactly right. You were standing, which the Orthodox Church still does today, and doesn't heat their buildings either. Just like most European churches are not heated, right? What was your part in the service?
Amen.
Very little, right? Amen. That's a good one. You might know a few phrases. But largely the dynamic of worship is being acted out between the priest and the choir, right? The priest and the choir representing the people. And so, so this back and forth, including, so all of your participation would have been done by the choir, which you got to partake in by experiencing it, a very experiential sort of, but experiential yet non-participatory way of worship, which is a very interesting sort of idea. And then what happens on October 31st, 1517? Martin Luther puts a little tiny list of 95 suggestions on a church wall. Right on a church door. Just suggestions. That's all they were, right? Maybe they were strongly worded, but right. So Luther posts his 95 theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, and the Reformation happens. And the Reformation is incredibly important in church from the standpoint of church music, because one of the things that Luther does really quickly is he takes the music away, not away from. In addition to giving music to the choir, he gives music to the people. Right. One, he switches the language of the Mass to the vernacular, which is German. In fact, he outlined a Mass called his Deutsche Messe, German Mass of 1526. And it looks just like the Latin Mass, only it's all translated into German. And for those parts of the liturgy, Luther actually adapted chants and then put German words for the Sanctus, the Holy, Holy, Holy. The Lamb of God, for that was actually written by someone else. I can't remember anymore who that was. I used to know. And then he also wrote some individual hymns and stuff like that for the own liturgy. But before we get to the Reformation, in earnest, I'd like to go back just a little bit. I kind of skipped over something really kind of cool. One of the things that we have with the hymnal 1982 is that we have an extremely eclectic hymnal. And all of the things that I'm talking about today, you can find examples of in the book. So this book contains music that's been sung for over 1,000 years. It wasn't obviously not in the original language, but the music itself is still here. So I would like for you, please, to open your hymnals to hymn number 82. And there you go.
Give me mine back.
If you go to hymn 82, have an example. 82. Mm-hmm. Here we have an example of a hymn that comes to us directly from the Latin tradition, right? Divinum Mysterium, of the Father's love begotten. And interestingly, the way it's written in the book is this way. Right? And so this hymn actually is itself a historical example, because do you see the little note at the bottom of the hymn? This hymn may be performed in equal note values. Chant, the way we think of Gregorian chant, it's not a waltz, right? We don't think of Gregorian chant being... Right? Instead, we think of... So great Christmas hymn. The reason that we have this rhythm in the book is another tradition. And that's the tradition. That difference in rhythm in that hymn actually represents the beginning of us having different rhythms in music notation. Because based on the way a chant would begin, there were certain rhythmic modes that would be applied to it, and they were repeating patterns of rhythm. And this one is da 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 da. So that's why in the book the rhythms are there, because that would have been practice at the time, or one potential for practice. And did you know that? Of course not. Nobody knows that except musicologists. It's the stuff we look at, we're like, huh, that's really cool. Too bad nobody knows. All right, and now turn with me to a hymn 271. I guarantee you probably don't know this hymn because we very seldom find ourselves celebrating the feast of the Nativity of John the Baptist. However, this chant is incredibly important. This chant is more important than you know. And I bet you all are familiar with this chant, with this hymn, without ever knowing. Right? We start here. How many of you know that? No, but it's okay. I don't know it either. But there's a really good reason. All of the hymns in the book have been. They're all there for a very, very good reason. And so let's give this one a go. Let's see if we can do this one. So you can sing the Great Forerunner of Lamore. So here we go. The Great Forerunner. Like, Jason, so what? Right? It's okay. It's okay. I am going to sing you a slightly different version of this. The melody is slightly altered. I'm going to try to get back to it. I'm doing this mostly from memory. But this is if you look at the Latin of this hymn, right? This starts off, Utsque ant laxis resonare fibris, mira gestorum famulituorum, solve polluti labire hatum sancte Ioannis. Okay, now, again, you're still wondering, I love taking you on this journey because there's no way to know where we're going to end up. And if I tell you you'll end up at the sound of music, you're thinking I'm insane, but it's true. It's true. All right, so if you look at the Latin of this hymn and you look at the hymn in the book, what does the first phrase start on? What note does it start on? Music readers? Starts on a C. In Latin, that is, in Latin, the chant bore the word ut on C. The next phrase begins on, it's actually in the middle of a phrase. If you look at the word, it's on ner, because this is in English, so the words don't line up quite as well. But the next phrase in the Latin begins on the word re, and it's on the word D. The next phrase in the Latin begins on the word mira, mi, and it starts on E. The next phrase in the Latin begins on the word famuli, first syllable being fa, on an F. Next phrase starts with sol. Next phrase starts with la. We've switched ut to do. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. Right. So, do, la, fa, mi, do, re. So, do, la, ti, do, re, do. Do, a deer, a female deer, and that's where that comes from. It comes from a Latin chant written down by Guido Varezzo in the 7th century as a way of teaching solfege, or solfa system, so you can teach music. And so that's where that comes, and that's in our book. And it's right in the place it should be, because it's the hymn for the Nativity of John the Baptist. And so it's a lovely, lovely example to look in the book and see this piece of music and be able to trace it back through, what are we, the 21st century now? 14 centuries. It's gorgeous. So anyway, so everything's going along very well with Gregorian chant. There's tons of chants being written all the time. And then Luther causes his troubles and decides that people need to be more involved in the worship that they are doing, and so nails up his 95 suggestions and then starts writing hymns. Right. So in addition to Luther's hymns for the service, he writes hymns about baptism. When Jesus came to Jordan's stream, which we have in our book. But Luther actually didn't, now Luther was also a musician, right? Luther was a lutenist. So he did, in order to get the music for the Lutheran service after the Reformation, what he did was he actually took what he had. He started off with Gregorian chant, because that was the music of the church at the time. So if you look at hymn number 54, this is an example of what Luther did to make church music more accessible to people in the pews. Non kom der Heiden Heiland.
They didn't have pews.
All right, I'm sorry. Anachronistically, the people in the pews. Okay, so the people standing. Right, but here we have. A very simple melody. Furnished with rhythm. Michael Pretorius, who was roughly a contemporary of Luther a little bit later, has an organ piece that's based on this that's more evened out. A solus Ortus Cardine, maybe something like that. Right? Not just one step away from Gregorian chant, only this time furnished with a little bit more rhythm. So we should probably sing too, because you have to do that. All right, here we go. Stanza 1, Savior of the Nations come. Yeah. Savior of the nations come, church Son, make it thy home. God on heaven and earth, that your Lord chose All right. So, and then, of course, we have in our books at number 687? 688. Let's start off with 687, because I need to teach you the real version. All right? 687, please. First 687. Okay, so, right. What does it say what the words are? What is your word? What does it say? Yeah, it tells you what the words are at the bottom. Okay, so so Luther wrote A Mighty Fortress as what? If you look at the word indication there. Right, it's a paraphrase of Psalm 46, right? So remember, at the time that Luther is working at the Reformation, where instrumental music is still very much a part of the service, at the same time you have folks like the Calvinist and other Reformed traditions who are also looking to take the music out of Latin and give it back to the people. But what they do is only use the book of Psalms. So instead of developing hymns that are freely composed or based on Psalms, they do what are called metrical psalters. So they take the entire book of Psalms, make it into hymn texts that rhyme and that are regular in their meter, and then are furnished with tunes, and those are sung a cappella without any accompaniment, right? Because in that tradition, instrumental music was out. But we don't have that quite yet. Right, so we have A Mighty Fortress. So Luther was a Renaissance composer, right? So it was not yet to Bach. Bach is a Baroque composer. The Baroque period starts roughly 1600, we say. So in the Renaissance, rhythms were quite more, there were a lot more variety of rhythms. There was a greater level at which we would subdivide big beats, and there were interesting juxtapositions, and composers would write music that would go from 1 and 2 and 3 to 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 as a way of adding variety into music. Those are called changes in prolation and mensuration, if you're interested in that sort of stuff. And so when Luther wrote his A Mighty Fortress, the version that he wrote was the version we see at 687, right? And sing this one, right? Yeah, that's the same words, right? Here we go. I'll count 1 2 1, and then we'll start. 1 2 1. Mighty fortress is our God, our Lord never failing. Ever He amid the flood, our portal is remaining. For still running through the sea through murderous woe, His craft and power great, and none with whom obeyed. On earth is not His equal. Right? It's jazzy. It's so much more interesting to sing than beep, 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 ba, 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 which is what we have for the next one. Right? Hymn 688 is the one in the English and Anglican tradition that is definitely the more prevalent of the two. Now, how do you describe the latter in relation to the former? How do you describe that version, the one that we normally sing, in relation to, or vis-a-vis the earlier, Luther's original? How would you describe it?
It's,
It's harmonized for one thing.
there's no meter either.
Actually, in our book, none of the hymns have meters.
No?
There are no time signatures printed in our book. I will have to go back and look and see why the editors did that. But there are no time signatures in our book anywhere.
It's more mature.
More mature. That's kind of getting at it. It's not quite embellished. Stayed. Okay. More regular. Right, more regular. Would you say it's more freeform or more bounded? More bounded. It's easier to sing. Okay?
Well, and part of that's because that's the way we're used to hearing.
Right. So the question is, what happened between Luther and Bach? Right, the one we have in the book is a Bach harmonization. That's why we have it. We have many Bach harmonizations in the book because they're so wonderful. They're absolutely brilliant. And so we've got that one, and it's very different than Luther's. Right now, in the Lutheran tradition, congregations do sing in unison. Primarily, hardly ever in parts that you sing in a congregation. That's still reserved for the choir, part singing. So what we have, and it's again just the way that the of the Father's love begotten reflected the difference in usage between the rhythmic mode, a rhythmic version, and an even version. Here we have the same thing. Luther's is what we call the rhythmic version of his hymn, and 688 is Johann Sebastian Bach's adaptation of it in what's called an isometric version, where the meter is more regularized. And what happened from about 1675 to 1750 in Germany is you see the age of pietism and the rise of rationalism. And so what this meant was that the church was sought to restore a more vigorous spiritual life through Bible study, prayer, and charitable acts. And this found its way into the music, which was in essence sort of simplified. If you were singing this in unison, it's easier because you can tap your foot to it, right? And so you don't have these kind of the more complex rhythms that you did in the Renaissance. They made the music more accessible for people so they could use it, say, in their homes, right? Because after all, now we do have printed materials at this point, right? Some early hymnals started coming out as early as, say, okay, so Reformation happened in 1517, and then he was excommunicated in 1519, and then No, the bull went out in 1519, he was excommunicated in 1521, I think. In 1524, we have a Lutheran hymnal being published. Not big hymnal, but it's a hymnal as early as 1524. And so there was the ability to have music in the home. And of course you would have the German tradition as well of Tafelmusik, right? Tafelmusik, which means that after you finish dinner, you had a party, after you finish dinner, everybody comes around the table, you get out your music books and your instruments, or you start singing, and that's your evening's entertainment, right? So that was a very kind of big part of normal cultural lives. And we see that again reflected in the hymns we have. We see the two versions in the book, one reflecting an earlier tradition, one a later in the tradition of pietism and rationalism. So now, at this point, we've been talking about hymns. We've been talking about Latin hymns primarily and German hymns. And if you look at the tune name of either one of those hymns, it's called Ein fester Burg, right? Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott. And that is also the German text of the hymn. Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott, ein guter Wehr und Waffen. Right? hilft uns frei aus aller Not, die uns hat betroffen. Is the next part. I can't remember after that. But at this point, though, things start to diverge. Right, we see the rise of metrical psalters in Calvinism. We see Lutherans writing hymns. Basically, every reformer who's running around who doesn't get burned at the stake is publishing a little hymn supplement to go along with their books. Right? Just to give you a same idea, don't forget Marbeck over in England, right, with a Book of Common Prayer 1549, and his chants for the liturgy are based on Gregorian chant, right, but only anglicized, and those are, by the way, the same chants that we have in our Rite One music that we use, only harmonized, modern, changed slightly as we from different permutations of the hymnal. But again, that stuff is there. So, but at this point, with the proliferation of hymnody across a number of traditions, across a wide geographic area with different traditions, we now have to start talking about the anatomy of a hymn. When we talk about hymns, we always refer to hymns have two parts. One is the text, and that's normally what we refer to by the title, A Mighty Fortress, right? Joyful, joyful, we adore thee. Love divine, all loves excelling. And then the other part of the hymn is the tune, which we refer to by a different name. So if you're in church music, you always are thinking about every hymn you sing has two parts, and you're always thinking of the tune name. Let's see. Name a hymn. Let's see how good my tune name thing is. Praise my soul, the King of Heaven. That's the tune name is Lauda Anima. Right. That's that one. Because what happens is when we're looking for tunes, most musicians don't really worry about what the words are when you're looking for a setting of a certain tune. And so a lot of our stuff that's published is published by tune names. And so we always work in these kind of things. Now, it could be a foreign language, like in the example of the Gregorian chant or the German, it's the actual words of the original hymn. And then we adapt that to the tune name. It can be a given name that the composer of the tune likes. Maybe it was Down Ampney, for example, was the area around which, that's Ralph Vaughan Williams, right? Am I right? Maybe. I could be wrong. But Down Ampney is a geographic location. There are, Deidre is a name, just a name. Grand Isle. I don't know what Grand Isle was, but Lesbia Scott, when she wrote her hymn, I Sing a Song of the Saints of God, that tune name is Grand Isle. And so all of those have stories behind them as well that we don't know necessarily everything about. And so that is a big, where we are right now, that's a big chunk of the history of hymnody, right? So once we move from an oral tradition into a written tradition, and then we move hymnody from Latin into the vernacular, now we're set for the proliferation of hymnody across all worship all over the world. And that's where we'll pick up next week. Right. So, all right, that was really quick. We only got to the 16th century. That's not too bad. We covered a lot of ground. So at this point, by the way, just the books you see here, these are in case I need a quick reference. This. Okay, so may I borrow this?
Sure.
This is the hymnal. This is the companion to the hymnal, which has in 2 volumes a little paragraph about every hymn text and every tune in the book. This first one is about some of the rationale for the hymnal, the sources where they came from, a brief history of hymnody and service music across all of history. And volume 2, covers the music of the service as well as the text, and then biographies of a lot of people. And then these 2 volumes are the hymns in the book, all 720 discussed with where they came from and that sort of stuff. So when the Episcopal Church set out to create a new hymnal, and Ray Glover, who wrote this book, Marion Hatchett, James Litton, they're all monoliths in recent church history. But they really set out to make an incredible volume with representation from all sorts of time periods. Remember, in 82, things were different. So we actually have representation of spirituals in a hymnal, which was pretty remarkable for 1982, especially considering that work probably began at least 10 years before that in the 70s. So there would be plenty of places where that would have not been allowed. And in fact, I don't mean not permitted, I mean it wouldn't have made its way in. And in fact, for us, we still weren't. And then there was a whole nother hymnal that we have that has primarily music from African American sources in it and stuff. So, but anyway, I have to run off to choir. I'm very sorry to leave you. But next week, what we're going to do is we're gonna kind of go a little bit farther into some of the different types of hymns that we have, carols, some Welsh hymn tunes, some metrical psalms, and Victorian hymnody, and then we'll get a little nod to Vatican II, because Vatican II is also a big element in the history of church music, as you well know. And then just to let you know, hymn writing is not a lost art. This is the Dallas Hymnary. This was published in June by the Association of Anglican Musicians, which is the national body for Episcopal Church musicians. And so these are a number of my colleagues and other hymn writers in the U.S. who have written hymns for use. So we still have modern hymns being written as well today. So, all right, I'll see you next week. I'll clean all this up later. Okay. Okay. I'll see you at church.
All right. Well, thank you to Dr. Jason. So what do you all think? What was something that you'll carry forward coming out of this class? Brilliant. Yes, he is brilliant. Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes?
That one hymn that he mentioned, the footnote said it really was written on the Venerable Bede. This is sort of about the Venerable Bede.
Yes. Well, you go ahead. Continue on.
That's it.
Oh, that's it.
He was in the early English British Isles, we'll say.
Yes.
Priest, I guess.
Yeah, and there is a lot of connection.
Historian.
Yes, historian. What Father Phillips was talking about is that one hymn that was mentioned had the Venerable Bede mentioned at the bottom. And you'll see, as what Jason was pointing out, there's a lot of history within our hymnal. We are not singing just things of the contemporary, but kind of a whole breadth of church music and church history, and how it's been passed down and how we've continued to play with it. Something that we think about is that what we sing, we sometimes say we are praying twice. So if you pray, you sing, you pray twice. And that we see that with our hymns, that there will be certain emphases based on the melody that's been paired with it. So sometimes you see that we have hymns with more than one of those melodies, and Dr. Jason was just starting to get into that before he ran off, that they talk about the hymn text as well as the tune, because sometimes the hymn text can be paired with multiple tunes. And when you have that happen, it's important to pay attention on what is different, what's different being conveyed. If the melody is going up to a certain point and you have that climax, that word is being signified. Oftentimes it's God or Jesus or something that's pointing our attention, that we are gravitating upwards. And then likewise, if you have it going down and then you get to the depths, you can feel that in your soul and in your heart, and that can emphasize either suffering or pain or something else going on. And so when you change the tune, you emphasize different parts of the hymn text. And just as he pointed out at the very beginning, the Psalms were our first hymns. These are ones that we were praying as we continue to do today. When we sing hymns in church, we are lifting up our voice in praise of God. So I just wanted to throw that little bit in that I'm sure he will harp on more next week. And so I'm so excited to see part 2 because he said we'll be getting into a few more hymn texts and looking through. So think about what are some of your favorite hymns. Anybody want to mention what's a favorite hymn of yours? Amazing Grace is a great one. Yeah, and that has a story behind it too, of somebody who had a complete conversion in his life. And so that conversion experience and impacted what he wrote and what we pray. Yes, what else?
The church is one foundation.
Yes, 525. Great hymn. Next week, Father Michael, when he ends the class, will probably talk about that one a little bit more. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because I know Dr. Jason will be talking about that next week as well. But yes, it's a beautiful hymn. Makes me cry every time. It's
Praise to the Almighty.
praise the Almighty, yes. Lift high the cross, yes. And that's significant if you're part of the Order of the Daughters of the King. That's their hymn. It reminds us what our duty is as Christians and what it is to be a disciple, yes. And how we glorify God. Absolutely. That's a neat one that also has this kind of, I don't know if it would be called an antiphon, but it's where you have this repeating phrase that you would sing in between each of the verses. So it kind of acts like an antiphon. Yeah. Other ones?
There was one I was thinking of, and I can't think of the name of it, but and one of the verses for those in peril of the sea, it's
Yes. Yeah, we talk about the Navy hymn, 680. So eternal Father, strong to save, or eternal God, strong to save. Yes, those in peril. It's a beautiful one, and we sing that one quite frequently here. Yeah. Yes, a lot of funerals too, because we also have a lot of servicemen and women who've served our country, and so yes. Yes, Meg.
Katie, can I say 60 years in the Anglican Church?
Uh-huh.
Sometimes I think, look at it, oh, good, we're having this hymn today. And then it's a tune I've never heard.
It's a different tune. Exactly.
It's a big disappointment.
Oh, yeah, especially when you know the tune and then you're expecting it and then it's like, oh, that's different. Yes, and I have that moment sometimes too, that in our hymnal we have certain texts that are paired with the tunes, and then if you are part of other parts of the Anglican Communion, they may have paired that same text with a different tune. So again, it highlights that there's different things, and it may bring that nostalgia factor too. But yeah, so it exposes us to a breadth of different tunes as well as the hymn texts.
An example of that, of course, is the permutations of the 23rd Psalm.
Yes, so true. So Psalm 23 has had, partly there's a lot of different ways the text has been arranged, and then there's a lot of different tunes, as you were mentioning. Yes. Yeah, there's quite a few.
Fremont is the one that's most famous and most popular, at least in the Anglican Church.
In the Anglican Church. Yes.
I thought it was funny what he was saying before about the picture of from the book that they would hold up,
Uh-huh.
and he's emphasizing the part. I noticed that the parts that were abbreviated also had like the stylized letters, like super like. Yeah.
Yeah.
They put so much work into the letter, and then they abbreviated the rest.
Sometimes in a long time.
Yes, on that one letter, and then let's just abbreviate the rest. Yes, and you'll find that with other things besides things that are sung. You'll find a lot of that kind of thing going on. Yes. Yeah, even in scripture you would have that too. That, the first line of Mark's gospel, for example, is just like 2 letters for each of those words, but it's highly stylized in some versions. That illumination that was going on. Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, I need to go get vested as well, but thank you all, and a special thank you to Dr. Jason. Again, just really opening our eyes up to what we sing every single Sunday. And so as you go forth today and you're looking at the hymnal, we have some great hymns again. And so see what you notice from today, and especially next week as we get into the more of the breath, and he said more of the more modern hymns coming out of the 16th century into the present day. See what those features are. And again, thinking about how what we are saying is how we are praying. So lifting our voice in song, how is that shaping your prayer that you're lifting up to God? So we'll see you all in just a moment or next week, and take care.